In a previous video, we learned how to control the speed of playback going into or out of a keyframe via the keyframe assistant. This is what we call ECEs in, ECEs out, or ECEs. And this is a way that the program allows us to create more natural motion in between keyframes so that the speed of change between those two keyframes tends to look a little bit more natural and not as mechanical as linear animation. Now, that can only take us so far within our animations. And I want to show you an example of where this becomes useful, but it doesn't take us all the way. So in this video, we're going to create a composition of a ball bouncing off the floor. And in order to create that, we're going to be using those the keyframe assistant. So let me go ahead and create a new composition. And I'm going to call that composition bouncing ball, because I like to keep my naming convention. That makes sense. I'm going to retain the settings as I had them on our previous video, which is 1280 by 720, 30 FPS, and 5 seconds long. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And into this composition, I'm going to bring this Illustrator file of a beach ball. Now that's gigantic, so I'm going to scale it down to about 20. And so that is a size that we can work with. Now, let me expand this a little bit so we better see what we're doing. What I want to do now is I want to position this up at the top. And the goal is to have this ball bounce from top to bottom. So first things first, I want to move my anchor point to the bottom of the ball. So I'll use my pan behind tool to move the anchor point. I'm pressing shift as I'm dragging to constrain to the y-axis. And then I'll place it right at that anchor point or right below the ball so that it's bouncing from there. That's not a necessary step, but I like to do that. Now, what I want to do is I want to select the layer in the timeline, and I'm going to press the P key to call the position property for the ball, and I'm going to set up keyframes. First keyframe I'm going to set up is right at the beginning, and I'll press the stopwatch to set that first keyframe. That's where it's going to start, and I'm going to make this a round number, 185. And then, so that's the value for X and Y for that position, 640 by 185. Now, what I want to do is I want to calculate in real time how long it would take for a ball to fall down on the floor and bounce right back up. So if you were to throw a ball and make it bounce, it probably will take about a second for the entire motion to happen. So that means that my ball will go down in about 15 frames. So I'll place my time marker at 15, or I can click on the SMPTE code and enter 15, or I can press on the SMPTE clock right here that opens up the go to time window and enter 15 frames, hit return, and it takes me there. Or I can use the shortcut Alt Shift J, or in the Mac it would be Command Shift J to open up this window, which is the go to time window, and enter 15 frames. Now when I do that and hit return, it takes me to the 15 frame mark. So those are 4 ways that you can actually move your time marker where you need it to be. That done, what I'm going to do is at that point, I am going to switch my tool back to the arrow tool, and I'm going to bring down my ball by moving it with the arrow and pressing the shift key as I'm dragging down so that I can move and constrain to the y-axis. Now I'm going to place that ball right at the floor at that point, and then at the 1 second mark, I am going to select the first keyframe on the timeline, copy it, Control C, and then paste it on where my time marker is. So basically, I have the ball bouncing. Now, when I play this back, I see that my motion is very mechanical. As you can see, my motion is extremely mechanical. It's very linear. So we don't want that. But if we think about how things act in the real world, that ball should be taking off slowly and accelerating towards the floor. When it hits the floor, it bounces right back up and starts decelerating as it comes to a rest up at the top. So that means it will be accelerating ECEs out of the first keyframe and ECEs into the last keyframe. So I'm going to ECEs out of the first keyframe by selecting that keyframe, right-clicking, and from the Keyframe Assistant flyout menu, I am going to choose ECEs out. And then on the last one, on the last keyframe of my animation, I'm going to select the keyframe, right-click it, Keyframe Assistant, ECEs in. You will notice that the between frames, the in-between frames get closer at the top, which means my motion is slower, because the rate of change, the time is the same, the rate of change of the time, the space that it moves across the screen, the position change is smaller, even though it's using the same amount of time. While at the bottom, they get more separated, meaning that the rate of change is faster as it goes towards the bottom, and that's what I want. So let me go ahead and play this back. And you'll notice that it's slightly better. It is slightly better, but still very mechanical. It's still not there yet. It's very, it's just mechanical. There's no way, it's better, but it's not there. So what do I want to do if I want to fine tune it? If I really want the ball to start falling ever so slowly and accelerating as it goes towards the bottom, I need to modify the rate of change. I need to get in there and modify the actual speed rate at which things change. And so to do that, we have access to this little tool here called the Graphing Editor. It's in your switches window right here. Now let me go ahead and select all three keyframes that I want to affect with the Graphing Editor. I'm going to drag a selection across all three, and then I'm going to click on that switch. You will notice that my timeline changed to fit to something completely different. Basically, I am seeing curves and I'm seeing lines. Now, what you're looking at right now might not look, and yours might not look like mine. Yours might look completely different because it's the first time that you're using that Graphing Editor. If you see the lines, but you don't see everything like I do, I want you to click on this swatch right here. Notice that the timeline changed completely. I no longer see the other layers, even though I didn't have any. I don't see anything else there, but I do have a new set of icons down here. These icons basically allow you to see what you want to see within that window. You can show selected properties. You can show the Graphing Editor set, animated properties, and so on. You can also choose what you're looking at in the graph. What does this graph represent? Right now, it's representing the edit value graph. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Now, the things that you want to actually work with right now to see the entire graphing options or the entire graph, sorry, is to click on this icon here. That fits the entire graph to the length of your timeline. So first things first, let me go ahead and stretch this timeline up a little bit so that I gain a little bit more real estate. And then I'm going to click on this guy. Now you'll notice that basically that reduced the zoom in value of my work area of my timeline. You notice that this basically got zoomed in and I can see the entirety of the graph. Now that we see it at this size, we can recognize things that, if we look at this in detail, we know that this is counting time towards the right, meaning it's downstream. And if you look at these values, they're pixel values. So this is a graph of the amount of pixels changed over time. So the vertical is the amount of pixels changed. The horizontal is the time. And if we pay attention to this, we're looking at two colors, where green is the X value, the Y value, red is the X value. X being the horizontal. So since there's no horizontal change of my animation, my rate of change is none, is zero, it stays put. While my y-axis change, which is the green, actually represents the curve, saying, okay, so this is what your animation is doing. So I see both of my x and y values represented here for position. But I don't have access to any editing tools for this curve. This is just the representation. So now if I want to change the curve to control the amount of the rate of change up here, I need to switch my Graphing Editor to the Speed Graphing Editor. So if I click on that, you'll notice that I get a different kind of curve and I still don't see the entire curve. I see something else. So again, to see the entire curve, I want to select this icon, and then that showcases what is going on up here. This curve represents what is happening with the motion here, where my ball takes off and it gets to a point that it's going about, this is the speed of change at which it is changing as it goes towards the second keyframe. And then when it bounces off the second keyframe as it goes towards the third keyframe. So let's go ahead and figure out what this is doing for us. Let me go ahead and select that keyframe here. And you'll notice that I now have activated all these little icons here, which if you have worked with graphs anywhere, whether it is Illustrator paths or if it's Maya graphing, or any other program that you use Bezier handles, you'll recognize that that's what these are. They're Bezier handles that allow you to control the interpolation between the two keyframes. So if I understand that this is the rate of change at which things are changing in this graph, then modifying this graph will make a change to the speed of playback here. So let me go ahead and extend this to increase its speed. And you'll notice that there's a change in the tween frames there. Let me select this one as well and bring that in. Select it and bring it in. And then fit my entire graph just to see how we're looking. Now I can go back and switch my graph to see what this is doing to my curve here. And if I fit that, that seems to show me that my change in speed is going to be slow, 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 and it's going to accelerate as it goes towards the bottom. And then it's going to take off really fast from the bottom and it starts slowing down as it goes towards the next keyframe. So let's play this back really quick to see what that did to my animation overall. That seems to look a little bit more natural that's a bit more natural of a bounce. And you'll notice that basically what I'm doing is controlling the shape of the curve on this graph through the speed graph. And then I can just go ahead and keep modifying until I get results that I want. You'll notice that each one of the keyframes, each one of the sides of the frame is independent from one another. So if I move one, I can go fast or slow into one and accelerate really fast out of the other one. What I really want to do here is I want to bring that in. Let's see, actually, let's bring that up a little bit. Let's bring this up a little bit and bring in the curve. So you start manipulating this until you get a curve that sort of matches what you're targeting, until you see what the rate of change is, that best matches what your goal is for that animation. Let's see what this curve does when I make it look like this. Let's go back to the value graph. Let's match everything. And that seems to be exactly what I want, which is I want to have my speed sort of almost flat, almost like it's not moving fast enough, and then take off really fast as it goes towards the bottom. When it hits the bottom, it will bounce really fast right back up and it starts flattening out as it goes again towards the next keyframe. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Boom. That's much better. That is a more natural bounce. So let me go ahead and exit my graphing editor by clicking on that switch again. Let me zoom out and let me bring in my out point for my animation to the 1 second mark by placing my time marker there and pressing the N key on the keyboard. Remember the shortcut IBON, I-B-O-N. And so if I do that and I just let it loop, my animation looks a little bit more natural. I still can, make it better by activating the motion blur switch on the layer, number 1. So that looks a little bit better, more natural. And 2, I can also sell this better. If I look at my principles of animation that we saw in the first module, I should be squashing that ball when it hits the bottom. But the animation is happening so fast that this looks fairly good. Now I can go ahead and get detail. If I want to add that squash, the ball is squashing around this point. So I'm going to deactivate the motion blur, and I am going to create scaling values for this. And that's the reason why I moved the anchor point to the bottom. So let me go ahead and open up the scale by pressing Shift S on the keyboard with the layer selected, press Shift S. And I want to make sure that I create a couple of keyframes here. One keyframe at the bottom that has a scaling value. Let's say I want to maintain that scaling value of 100% to about 1 frame before I hit the ground, which is right here. That's my scaling value. Then at the ground value, I want that to be on the y-axis only. I want it to squash like so. So I'm going to make it 13. And then one frame afterward, I am going to make a copy of the first keyframe right here. Control C, then paste it right after. And so the ball goes back to its natural shape. As you can see, that gives me that little squash that I was looking for. Now I'll activate the motion blur on the layer, and now the animation looks almost completely natural, like if this was a rubber ball. So that is what we use the graphing editor for. Now in this case, we only did it through position values. But the graphing editor works for any keyframe. So remember once again that the graphing editor is looking, it doesn't matter if it's position or if it's scale, what it is looking at is basically the value, the rate of change, which is this pixels versus time graph on the left-hand side going on the vertical versus the actual time on the timeline. So this indicates how much change is being applied to that particular property. So if this was rotation, that would show you rotation degrees versus amount of time. So it is the rate of change over time. That's what this is. And you want to control that graph to represent the actual motion or the change that you're applying to that specific transformation on the composition.